In this video, I'm going to take you through screen printing. Now, the basic principle of screen printing is that we create a stencil on a screen. So this is a screen frame, and it has a stencil for 2 layers. Okay, so we've got one layer here and the second layer here. And then we're basically pushing ink through the open area of the stencil onto paper. Normally it could be plastic, metal, wood, fabric, anything that's flat. Now, to start the process off, you need to select a screen, and we have a whole range of screens available for use. The basic rule of thumb when selecting a screen is that all brown tape should be removed from the inside, and any name tags and dates should also be removed. That's the indicator that the screen is free for you to use. Any screens in use will still have brown tape on the inside and a name and a date on the outside. If you're ever unsure, just come and speak to myself or Damien, and we'll always be able to find you a screen. Something else to consider is the size of your image in relation to the screen. You want at least 3 inches from the inside of the frame to the edge of the printed area, all the way round. Okay, so you can see with this screen, there's plenty of space. We've got plenty of space there, 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 and there. At least 3 inches. And that's so there's enough leverage for the squeegee to push the mesh down onto the surface that you're printing from. So, this is the screen frame I've selected, okay? The brown tape has not been removed, but I know that this screen is out of use. So my first job is to remove the brown tape. It's a sticky job. Don't worry too much if you cannot remove all of the brown tape, okay? It depends on the quality of the brown tape the student or member of staff has used beforehand. So this should be okay. Now, with your brown tape, just roll it up into a ball and place it into a bin. Try not to throw the brown tape ball into the bin because it tends to stick to the side and then the bin bag closes up. For now, I'm just going to pop it on the side and I'll pop it into the bin a bit later. What we need to do now is strip this stencil from the screen, okay? And we do that in the safe light room in the washout area. So this is the washout room, and inside the washout room we have a backlit washout booth with a hand spray just here. Underneath the washout booth we have 2 buckets. One with degreaser liquid, and there's a brush inside, and the second bucket has strip liquid, and there's also a brush inside there. Just in the corner, we have a pressure washer. So I'm going to pop some gloves on. So you do need to wear gloves when stripping the screen. And as we're stripping the screen, we're going to use the strip liquid. Take the lid off. Now I tend to bring the bucket up to here. Okay, if you are slightly accident prone, it's fine to leave the bucket on the floor. I'm going to dip the brush inside, give it a little shake, and then I'm going to brush over the mesh for about a minute or so. Now I'm going to turn the screen around and brush on the reverse side of the mesh. And we should start to see the stencil break down. Okay, so the stencil has started to break down. I'm just going to pop the bucket back under the washout booth, lid back on top, just push it under like so. Next job is to rinse the screen, okay, to remove the stencil and the strip liquid. And we'll use a small hand spray for this. To turn the water on, we have this lever here. Push it towards the light and lift out. And then you can squeeze the handle of this hand spray and start to spray. Sometimes the trigger sticks. There's a little button on the trigger that if you press, it should release the trigger and stop the water. It is a little bit temperamental. If it does not, you can just push this in and the water will switch off. Pop it back. Just resting position and just push the lever down to switch the water off. As you can see, most of the stencil has been stripped and washed away. We've still got some information on the mesh and we'll need to pressure wash that from the mesh. You're always going to need to use the pressure washer, okay? We will have a step-by-step guide to using the pressure washer up on the wall. Always read through the step-by-step guide, okay, before you use the pressure washer. If you're unsure after reading through the step-by-step guide, just come and ask Damien and myself and we'll just help you out. To start off with, we're going to lift this and we're going to turn the power on. And then it's very important that we actually lock these closed, okay? That prevents any spray or water getting inside. The next job is to turn the water on from the tap with the red hose. And just keep turning this until it stops, like so. Okay, we'll then take the gun and we're just going to squeeze the trigger. Holding it for about 5 seconds. That will just remove any pockets of air. We're now ready to turn the unit on, and you'll hear it grumble. Okay, so the unit is now ready to use. When we pressure wash the screen, we always apply the pressure wash to the flat side of the screen. Okay? Try to keep a good 2 to 3 inches away from the inner edge of the frame. We don't need this for our image. If you remember, this is just for leverage. When pressure washing, if you hold the pressure washer like so, squeeze the trigger and just gently work your way up to the halfway point of the screen like so. By holding the pressure washer at a slight angle, that will reduce the mist coming back at you. Once you've reached the halfway point, just turn the screen round. Remember, we only spray onto the flat side and do the other half. Okay? When using the pressure washer, make sure you use the goggles. We also have ear protection if you feel you need to use that. When using the pressure washer, have the end of the nozzle about 1 inch away from the mesh, okay, just like I did there. So we get it up nice and close, and that should really clean the mesh down. Once we've finished with the pressure washer, we turn the water off. We turn the unit off. And we turn the power off, and then make sure that lid is locked again. As I mentioned earlier, this will all be on the step-by-step guide. Always double check to make sure your screen is nice and clean. If you hold it up to the light, if there are any areas physically blocking the light, they will need a little bit more cleaning. So you may need to use the pressure washer again. If it's still there, we will need to use a gel to further clean, and that will take the mesh back to a brand new condition. Sometimes you'll see some ghost image, okay, that's just staining of the mesh. Don't worry about that too much. As long as that's not physically blocking the light, we're okay. Our next job is to degrease the screen. Pop my gloves on again. Bring out the degreaser liquid. And we're going to brush each side of the mesh for a minute or so each side. We're just going to leave the screen to stand for a couple of minutes so that the degreaser really gets in there and degreases the mesh. We degrease the mesh to make sure we remove any greasy marks. If there are any greasy marks on the mesh, they could repel the emulsion that we'll be using when we come to coat the screen. After a couple of minutes, we just use the hand spray and rinse down each side of the mesh. Give the screen a shake, and we're going to now place the screen into the drying cabinet inside the safe light room. Okay, that's the drying cabinet inside the safe light room is just for freshly cleaned screens. We also have a drying cabinet outside the safe light room, which is strictly for freshly emulsion screens. Always place the screen like so. Obviously, do not touch the mesh because you could transfer greasy marks from your fingers onto the mesh. And we always place wet screens at the bottom, like so. Just pop it in, corner and push it. There will be times during the trimester when this is full, so you may need to just move screens around. If you're unsure at first, just give myself or Damien a shout and we can come and help. We then leave that for 25 minutes to dry. So this is our clean and degreased screen, and it's ready for coating up with the light sensitive emulsion. So I'm going to place the screen on the floor just here. There's a piece of wood on the floor, and I'm going to place the frame side against the piece of wood and then lean the screen against the wall so we can apply the emulsion to the flat side of the screen. If the emulsion is not here, it will be in the fridge, which is just next to the risograph duplicator. It needs to be out for about 45 minutes to an hour before you use it. I have a coating trough here. We normally have coating troughs hanging on the wall, just here and just over here, but various sizes, but they're all being cleaned at the moment. We have a glass bowl for plastic edging. So we need to pop the edges on to the coating trough, like so. Sometimes the edges may kind of come away from the coating trough. If that happens, just grab another one, don't bother fighting with it. Always double check just to make sure the blade is nice and clean. If there's anything dried on there, that could affect your layer of emulsion. When using the emulsion, always wear gloves. It's an irritant. Remove the lid, and I'm going to pour some emulsion into the coating trough. I normally say go for about an inch and a half in width. Okay, so if you crouch down, one thing to remember is to make sure that your coating trough does fit inside the frame of your screen, okay? If it's wider than the frame of your screen, you're going to end up with a really thick layer of emulsion, which is not what you want. You just want a nice thin layer. There is a sign just there, just to remind you. Now I'm going to apply the edge or the blade of the coating trough about ½ inch up from the inner part of the frame, like so. I'm going to apply a small amount of pressure to give me a nice thin layer. I'm going to tilt the coating trough up, like so. And when the emulsion is making contact with the mesh evenly, keeping that little bit of pressure on, I'm going to drag the coating trough up the mesh. Listen for the sound. And I'm going to stop about 1 inch to 1.5 inches from the inner part of the frame. Keeping that little bit of pressure on, I'm going to lower the coating trough down and then do a little zigzag moving up just to take the excess. Then take the coating trough away from the mesh before you hit the frame. That will prevent emulsion going onto the frame. So what we should have is a nice even film emulsion, like so. We'll place this into the drying cabinet just outside the safe light room, again like so. Obviously we do not want to take this out into daylight for any length of time because it will start to expose, but just popping it out and into the drying cabinet will be fine.
Recording when you're ready.
Okay, now the freshly coated screen is in the drying cabinet. What we need to do is pour the excess emulsion back into the container. So we start to pour like so, and then I have a piece of cut card, which is from the cut card drawer in the main printmaking room. And what we're going to do, wearing gloves, is we're going to scrape with the curve of the coating trough, like so. Okay, as you can see, there's hardly any waste, which is what we want. So we'll pop the lid back on to the emulsion, and this will just sit here for the day, and at the end of the day will be popped back into the fridge by a member of staff. The coating trough needs to be cleaned, so if there's no one using the washout booth, you can take it in there, run some water, use a sponge to clean it all down. Make sure you take the edges off and clean the edges. Dry the edges and the coating trough with some paper toweling, and then put everything back to where you got it from. This is our freshly coated screen, okay? I popped it into the drying cabinet for 20 to 25 minutes. We're now ready to expose our image or layer onto the screen. Please refer to the Introduction to Positives video, okay, to get an idea about what you can use to expose onto screens. Again, if you have any questions, just give myself or Damien a shout. Lift the lid of the exposure unit. It's all switched on. Make sure the glass is clean. If there are any marks on the glass, they may expose onto your screen. I have a variety of positives here. We've got a drawing onto drafting film. We've got a half tone image that's been cut down. It's been digitally printed as well. We've got a piece of screen and my glasses. Okay, paper stencil. So there's a variety there. And I'm just going to assemble these on here. I'm going to place the flat side of the screen onto the glass, and ideally you want your image area to be fairly central. And also remember, we need that at least 3 inches from the edge, printed area, to the inner part of the frame. This is all good. I'm going to close the lid. I'm going to lock the lid. We have some information on the wall here about exposure times. A drawn line on tracing paper or drafting film would normally need a lower exposure time than something painted or drawn onto true grain. Okay, the true grain is thicker. You can also use oiled photocopies as a positive. That would need an even longer exposure time. Any questions, again, just come and ask myself or Damien. As we have a mixture of positives here, we're going to go for quite a low exposure time, as the drafting film is the thinnest piece, the thinnest positive we have. To alter or set your exposure time, we have a digi counter here. So at the moment it's set for 007, so that's 7 light units. Okay, we're going to go for 9 light units. That should be fine. Once you're happy with your exposure time, I'm going to switch the vacuum on, like so. Give it a few seconds to vacuum down. And then we press the little green button. When you press the little green button, the little green light comes on. So when you press the green button, the green light comes on. The bulb takes a couple minutes to get to the level for exposure. When it reaches that level, you'll notice that the counter starts to count down. What's happening with that process is that the screen and the layer of emulsion are getting an exposure of ultraviolet light. Wherever the ultraviolet light makes contact with the emulsion, it hardens the emulsion. Any areas protecting the emulsion or blocking the light, so for example, our paper stencils, our drawn marks on drafting film, a piece of scrim, our digitally printed halftones, those areas of emulsion will stay water soluble. Once the counter is counted down and reaches 0, the green light will switch off automatically and the red light will switch on automatically. At that stage, you can switch off the vacuum and give it about 10 seconds to disengage. Once it's disengaged, we can unlock the lid, lift it, and we'll take our screen frame to the washout room to rinse with water. Okay, we're now going to wash the image out of the screen. We're going to use the hand spray. Okay, this stage you can see that the water is starting to break down the image area of the emulsion. Okay, do not stop here. It's still blocked at the moment. Okay. Always double check that you've washed everything away by holding it up to the light. So either the backlight to the washout booth, or you can hold it up to the light on the ceiling, and you should be able to see very clearly where the ink will travel through the screen of the stencil. Okay. Just back to cleaning screens. If you are cleaning a large number of screens, we do have lab coats because sometimes you will get a bit wet. If the floor does start to get wet as well, we have a mop and a bucket, so please mop the floor after use. So we give the screen frame a shake and it goes back into the drying cabinet, okay, like so. And if you can remember, we've always placed wet screens on the bottom. As you can see, there's a screen bottom on this side. So very carefully, without touching the mesh, I'm just going to move it up to the next shelf. And I can pop my screen onto the bottom like so. Close the door, and that will take about 20 to 25 minutes to dry. So this is our screen. Okay, just taking it out of the drying cabinet, and what we need to do now is give the stencil another exposure of ultraviolet light, and this will just harden the stencil through. It's important that you do this. If you forget to do this or just try and take a shortcut, you may find that the stencil breaks down when you're printing or cleaning up after printing. Okay? So we're going to place the screen back onto the glass, flat side down like so. We exposed our screen for 9 light units, so we're going to harden it for 16 light units. So we would normally have a total of 25 light units. Okay, so that's for exposure and for hardening. If we exposed our screen for 15 light units, we would harden it for 10. Okay? The 25 light units is not always set in stone, because if we're using an oiled photocopy, we may need to expose for 20 to 22 light units. Okay, so then we might need to just go up to 30. Okay, but normally 25 light units as your total. Again, if you're in doubt, just come and ask. So all we need to do is close the lid. We don't need to lock it. We're going to set our exposure time for 16 light units. So that's 0, 1, 6. We don't need to use the vacuum. We just press the green button and the green light will come on. And just remember, it normally takes a couple of minutes for the bulb to get to where it needs to, and then we'll see the counter go down. When it hits 0, the green light switches off and the red light switches on. So we've hardened the stencil. What we need to do now is apply brown parcel tape on the edges and up to the frame. Okay, this will prevent ink travelling through this part of the mesh, and it will also prevent ink getting in between the mesh and the frame. You need to supply your own brown tape. We recommend you go for the sellotape or the Scotch tape round. So I'm going to pull a length of tape to fit inside the frame like so. Cut the tape. Then I'm going to fold the non-sticky side onto itself to create a hinge, and then line up the edge of the hinge where the mesh and frame meet. And then smooth the tape up the frame and onto the mesh, like so. Obviously you can see we've still got a gap there, so I'll run another length of tape along there. And we do that all the way round. Covered here, so I don't need to run an extra length there. There we go. Okay, and I'm just going to double check by holding it up to the light to make sure that it's all sealed. So that's fantastic. I'm now going to attach the screen frame to the screen table. Just undo these knobs. Like so. Now make sure the screen frame is in a position where you can comfortably reach over. Okay, like so. That's good. Tighten the knobs up. And then we'll lock it down. Sometimes you'll need to adjust these. Like so. Okay, that screen frame is not moving anywhere at all, so it's nice and secure. Now there's a space in between the mesh and the table. Okay, that space is called the snap. So when you apply pressure with the squeegee, pull down, the mesh will move down, the ink travels through the image area. As the squeegee moves along, the mesh snaps back up. Okay? I'm just going to talk about ink for a moment now. In terms of ink, we supply the System 3 acrylic medium, okay? You will need to supply your own acrylic paints and containers to mix your ink in. For a decent colour, strong colour, a mixture of 50-50, so that's 50% medium, 50% colour, will give a good colour. If you want a colour that's more transparent, less colour to medium, okay? When preparing for printing, make sure you have everything to hand, okay? So I've got my ink that I mixed in my tub earlier. I've got a bucket of water with a sponge underneath the table. Buckets and sponges are available from the Washout Room. I have a clean rag, a couple pieces of cut card, some newsprint to proof onto, and some paper to print onto. I'm just going to select our squeegee. So we have a range of squeegees just here, and we have a range just over the other side of the screen room. We need to make sure our squeegee is wider than our image. Obviously it needs to fit inside the frame. You don't want it to be too close to the edges of the frame. So this should be fine. Double check to make sure the squeegee is nice and clean. This is fine. The screen table has an on and off switch on the side. I'm going to turn the power on. Flick the switch. With the frame down, the vacuum is engaged. When we lift the frame up, the vacuum disengages. So the vacuum will hold our paper in position. We have a sheet of acetate attached to the screen table. We'll use this for registration, and we'll also use this to protect the vacuum holes when we clean up after printing. I'm just going to show you how to make some registration tabs. Registration tabs could be made from heavyweight cartridge, pieces of card, thin pieces of plastic. I tend to use masking tape and make one tab from 3 layers of masking tape. I'm just going to line them up like so. Pop them just there, and there's 2 that I made earlier. Okay, to start off with, I'm going to lift the registration sheet away from the table and just pop it down the side like so. And I'm going to use some newsprint just to proof onto. It can take 2 or 3 printings onto newsprint for the screen frame to start to print truly. Okay. I'm going to pour a puddle of ink on the near side of the screen frame, and a nice puddle to work with. I'm going to take my squeegee, I'm going to lift the frame, and you can either hold the frame or you can lean against it. I tend to lean against it. I'm just going to collect the ink up and then have the squeegee at a slight angle and apply a little bit of pressure, and we're just going to move the ink across the mesh like so. So we've flooded our image area with a thin layer of ink. We've flooded back. going to lower the frame down. And take hold of the squeegee with both hands at about a 45-degree angle. Push down and pull towards myself at a gradual pace. Lift the frame up, slight angle, little bit of pressure, and we're going to flood back in, like so. Pop this onto the drying rack. Do one more. So at this stage, if you're not happy with the colour, with the tone, with the actual image, we could clean up and remake the screen or remake the ink. Okay? I'm happy with how this is going. So what I'm going to do now is print onto the registration sheet. Now I'm going to make sure this is nice and flat. Lower the frame down. Okay, I'm just going to turn the vacuum off just so I can explain this part without the noise. So I'm ready to print onto my good quality printing paper, which has been cut to the same size. Doesn't have to be cut to the same size, but if we're making a number of prints, normally the paper would be cut to the same size. I'm going to slide the sheets of paper underneath, so now we can clearly see where that layer will print. Okay? Now, if we were to imagine that this was going to be the first layer of a 4-layer, 4-colour screen print, we'd want to register our first layer in exactly the same place on every sheet of paper. We could have some pencil marks just to help us indicate where we wish that layer to be. So this is fine. Just going to double check that's nice and flat. So that's good. I'm going to carefully fold the registration sheet back. I'm going to place my registration tabs down. Very carefully, right up to the edge of the paper. One there. There. So basically creating a corner. So every sheet of my paper will now slot in to this position. So the layer will print in exactly the same place on every sheet. Okay? And away we go. So we may have printed 5, we may have printed 55. So if you can imagine that this is the last one to print, we do not need to flood back, okay? Put this on the drying rack. So all 55 have gone really, really well. I'm now going to bring the registration sheet back over, so when I clean up, all of the vacuum holes will be protected. Okay? We'll take some spray. So basically what we've got in here is some soda crystals, a spoonful of soda crystals and water. I'm just going to spray onto the registration sheet. Lower the frame down. Got my cut card. If you've got any scrap pieces of paper around, you just bring them just to help prevent you making more mess. So, first job is to scrape the ink from the squeegee, like so. So that's most of the ink off. Just pop this to one side now, so it's just onto a piece of scrap paper. I'm going to collect the rest of the ink up that's on the screen front. So the more ink we get up here, the less there is to clean away. If you are quite a messy person, which is fine, we do have lab coats and old shirts that you can pop on. I would actually normally spray the image area of the frame before I do this, but it's been a while since I've done screen printing. There we go. Most of the ink is collected up. Spray over the mesh, like so. I'm going to pop my gloves on. And my first job is just to give the top of my container a wipe, just so I can get the lid back on. If it's a threaded container, you want to clean that thread, because if ink dries on the thread, the lid will not go on properly, and air will start to get into your container. Okay, that's fine. Just pop the lid on. Okay, when it comes to actually cleaning the stencil and the frame, you want to use as little water as possible. So we're going to squeeze as much water from the sponge, okay? And we're going to wipe over the image area first. And then the rest of the frame. Bucket. So the less water you use, the less mess you're going to make. Take my clean rag and finish the mesh off. Okay, so that's looking okay. Just dry off. Clean the registration sheet. The registration sheet needs to be left spotless so it's ready for the next student, member of staff or visiting artist to use. Manage to get ink anywhere else. Water, just give that wipe as well. Okay, so it's the squeegee now. Never place the squeegee into the bucket of water. This is hollow, it'll basically fill up with water. Just going to use a little bit of water. If the ink has dried to the squeegee, just use a little bit of the water and soda crystal spray. That will break it down. Squeegees need to be spotless as well. Managed to get ink all over the handles with that wipe down. That looks okay to me. Does that look good to you, Patrick?
Looks cracking.
And then we're going to pop that back on the rack, ready for the next person to use. And we always make sure that the blade is facing outwards, like so. Okay, at this stage, we're ready to get screen number 2 on to the screen table. Okay, the prints should have dried. And what we would do is repeat the process. So if you can imagine, our next layer is going to be a fluorescent pink. We proof onto newsprint. We then print onto the registration sheet. We would then take our prints with the first layer printed on, slide it underneath, okay, line it up to exactly where it needs to be. Our registration tabs would have probably been moved. So then we pop our registration tabs back down, and then carefully fold over the registration sheet, and then you print your fluorescent pink layer. Work through all your prints, and then you'll be ready to go with layer number 3. Okay? Again, any questions, just ask myself or Damien. If you finish for the day, empty your bucket in the washout booth, give it a rinse, okay? Give the sponge a rinse. Take your screen frame off of the screen table, pop it back into the screen cabinet where the screens are stored. Make sure you have got some brown tape on the edges of the frame with your name and a kind of an estimated date of when you'll be finished with the screen. Okay? Or you could say, right, I'm going to print layer 1 again, but in a red. There's lots of possibilities. Once you've packed everything away, popped it back to where you got it from, okay? Moved any rubbish, pop that into paper recycling or the rubbish bin, you're all done. So thank you for watching. Again, any questions, just come and speak to myself or Damien.